has spent 2 years turning its back on the proven tools and policies that Republicans use to strengthen our southern border. The Biden administration has spent 2 years turning its back on the proven tools and policies that Republicans use to strengthen our southern border. 2 years of a functionally open borders policy from Washington Democrats, and 2 years of chaos and suffering as a result. Last week, Customs and Border Protection announced that an already record-breaking year ended on a particularly catastrophic note. Illegal immigration apprehensions clocked at an all-time high of more than 2.7 million during the last fiscal year, by far the highest annual total ever recorded. But then December set an astonishing record all by itself at over 250,000 apprehensions. Last month was CBP's busiest month ever recorded. The American people are outraged at this willful failure. They rate immigration and border as one of the single biggest problems facing our country, second only to the economy. Two-thirds of the country disapprove of President Biden's handling of immigration and the border. That's a 67% supermajority of Americans who believe this administration is failing on border security. Now, our Democratic friends tie themselves in knots, making excuses for why they can't simply do their job, enforce federal law, and secure our border. Their far-left base makes them pretend that we can't enforce the laws on the books unless we find new ways to be even more generous to people who come here illegally. It's nonsensical. Every local official who belongs to the Democratic Party are rapidly losing patience with the Biden administration's border incompetence. The Democratic mayor of New York, Eric Adams, has spent months sounding the alarm on the catastrophic effects of this administration's functionally open borders. He said this is a national crisis. He said, quote, "There's no more room." He said, "There's no more room in New York." Yet the far left attacks him, the mayor of New York, for pointing out the problem. The Democratic governor of Colorado is taking a cue from Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis and arranging transportation for illegal immigrants to various liberal jurisdictions that have self-identified as so-called sanctuary cities. This is a growing bipartisan chorus that is begging President Biden to do his job and secure our nation. It doesn't take any new laws. It doesn't take some new grand bargain or amnesty. The administration just needs to do its job, secure the border, and let law enforcement enforce our laws. The Biden administration has all the tools and authorities it needs to tackle the crisis, if a solution were actually what they were after. Later today, the Speaker of the House and the President will begin bipartisan discussions about the future trajectory of our government's borrowing and spending. It is right, appropriate, and entirely normal that our need to raise the debt limit would be paired with negotiations regarding Democrats' runaway printing and spending. The American people changed control of the House because the voters wanted to constrain Democrats' runaway, reckless party-line spending. The voters of this country looked at the trillions of dollars of party-line spending, the runaway inflation, and the mountain of debt. And last November, they hit the brakes. We just experienced 2 years when Washington Democrats got to set policy without negotiating, and the American people put an end to it. Some Democrats are trying to rewrite history and pretend that Republican demands for negotiations are unusual. But that, of course, is just false. Back in 2017, the Senate Democratic leader said the debt ceiling gave Democrats, quote, leverage in broader talks. As the New York Times explained back in 2017, then Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic leader, quote, began formulating a plan to apply pressure, jettisoning the idea of backing a straightforward or clean debt limit measure as a way to gain muscle in coming negotiations. That was the Pelosi-Schumer playbook for the debt limit demand negotiations. Here's how the Democratic leader put it himself at the time. He said the debt ceiling, quote, gives another ample opportunity for bipartisanship, not for one party jamming its choices down the throats of the other. So I trust Democrats will be consistent with their past positions, and the White House will waste no time beginning the customary bipartisan negotiations with the new Republican majority over in the House. The President of the United States does not get to walk away from the table. The same president who happily signed off on trillions of dollars of needless party line spending needs to begin good faith negotiations on spending reform with Speaker McCarthy, and do it today. Now, on a related matter, there are lots of egregious ways that President Biden has wasted taxpayer money trying to buy up his low approval ratings. But the Democrats' proposal for student loan socialism is really one of the worst. It's like the Democrats paid scientists in a lab to invent the most unfair government handout that could possibly exist. Democrats want to take the graduate school loans of doctors and lawyers and white-collar professionals making six figures and put their debt on the shoulders of Americans who didn't take out loans at all. To the middle-class families who saved and sacrificed and skipped vacations to pay for more of their kids' college, the Democrats want to turn you into suckers. To the plumbers, firefighters, checkout clerks, and auto mechanics who made career choices to avoid taking on debt, the Democrats think the dentists and the lawyers deserve extra handouts at your expense. To the patriots who volunteered to serve our nation in uniform as part of a plan to attend college debt-free, the Democrats want to change the rules behind your back. President Biden and his party wake up every day looking for ways to transfer money and power away from the working class toward elites. But even for today's Democratic Party, this one is especially galling. This is reverse Robin Hood policy. Democrats stealing from the working class to reward people who are comparatively better off. It just isn't fair on a personal level. It's also staggeringly reckless fiscal policy. Remember, this whole undertaking was first set up as a short-term emergency measure at the very start of COVID. Those earliest weeks when the entire economy seemed to be in a free fall. That was almost 3 years ago. So shortly afterwards, thanks to the Bipartisan CARES Act that came out of the Republican-led Senate, the economy rebounded. Household savings actually went up. Many white-collar professionals spent months, if not years, working remotely from the comfort of their living rooms. Any legitimate reason for pausing loan payments evaporated just a few months after it began. But the Democrats have kept it going year after year. Now they want to magically wave away people's debts altogether. Needless to say, this would be enormously expensive for the country. If you add up the cost of three things, the nearly 3-year-long pause thus far, the mass jubilee the Biden administration is trying to defend in court, and the Democrats' proposal to turn the income-driven payment program into permanent socialism, the total cost of these three measures is projected to hit $1 trillion. $1 trillion. This estimate is from our colleague, Senator Cassidy, who is shining a bright spotlight on these terrible policies as the incoming ranking member of the Help Committee. On top of all the reckless inflationary spending that Democrats have pushed through, they want to redistribute up to another $1 trillion away from working-class Americans toward college-educated people who already earn higher salaries on average. The Democrats want to squeeze even more money out of cashiers, welders, first responders, janitors, and cosmetologists, and send it to a group of people who already out-earn those people on an average basis. More reckless spending, more debt and inflation, and no fairness for American families.
Leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
This evening, President Biden will begin the back half of his term with a State of the Union address to Congress and to the American people. But the White House attempts to script the message for this week have been upset by recent events. Over the last several days, the country learned that on President Biden's watch, the state of our union is apparently under Chinese surveillance from our own skies. It's ludicrous to suggest that Canada and the United States had no choice but to let this thing traipse across the continent from coast to coast. President Obama's own Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, says, quote, "We should have acted earlier." The administration's hand-wringing and indecision, finally downing the balloon only after it had toured the length of our country, was typical of how President Biden and his team have conducted our foreign affairs. Our top military commanders and civilian experts all say that our broader strategic competition with China is our most serious challenge. But this president's last budget request tried to cut funding for our military after inflation, while Beijing keeps investing in their own capabilities. The commander of our U.S. Strategic Command just told Congress that China now has more land-based intercontinental ballistic missile launchers than we do. The administration's reckless retreat from Afghanistan blew past the expert warnings, cost the lives of 13 American service members, let thousands of terrorists waltz out of prison, and incentivized others to challenge an America that looked cowardly. In hesitating, indecisive, self-deterred approach to helping Ukraine before Putin invaded, and the earliest days right afterwards left freedom's friends flat-footed and are making the subsequent fight more difficult than it ever had to be. And now the Biden administration has apparently pivoted from chasing another bad nuclear deal with Iran to trying to let terrorists out of Guantanamo Bay. These are just some of the reasons why 41% of Americans say the state of our union is weak, and only 13% say it's strong. Of course, this administration has also created problems for American families closer to home. A nationwide poll published last week revealed that just 16% of Americans say they're in a better financial situation today than they were 2 years ago when the president and his party assumed total control of government. For 84% of Americans, one-party Democratic control of Washington either failed to live up to its promises or actively made life worse. 2 years ago, over the objections of their own party's top economists, Washington Democrats misinterpreted a narrow election victory as a mandate for an unprecedented spending spree. When President Biden took office, inflation was at 1.4%. From Inauguration Day to today, inflation's over 13%. Working families have seen grocery prices jump 18.6%. Used car prices rise 26.2%. and energy prices soar by 33.9%. Millions of Americans have earned pay raises at work, but runaway inflation has left them with less purchasing power than before. Our southern border is in crisis, shattering all-time records for illegal immigrant apprehensions. Streets and neighborhoods are being swallowed up by violent crime. After local Democrats have cut police budgets, liberal prosecutors have turned jails into revolving doors, and national Democrats spent years amplifying the kinds of anti-police rhetoric that result in more crime. And President Biden is helping the radical left go on offense and bring a culture war to the doorsteps of normal American families, trying to squeeze Catholic hospitals and faith-based daycares out of business, trying to take school choice and curriculum transparency away from parents, and on and on and on. President Biden campaigned on being the adult in the room, but he's not even calling the shots in his own party. Over and over, on issue after issue, this president has handed the car keys to the radical left and turned himself into a passenger. That's why working families across the country have voted for change. They elected a Republican majority in the House of Representatives to put the emergency brakes on runaway liberal spending. They re-elected all-star Republican governors in places like Texas, Georgia, and Florida. And they elevated a talented new generation of leaders, including the youngest serving governor in America, Governor Sanders of Arkansas, whom the American people will hear from tonight. Our country may still be struggling to understand what on earth Washington Democrats think they've actually accomplished in the past 2 years, but they can be absolutely sure where Republicans stand. Now, one final matter. January was the 21st month in a row with year-on-year inflation of at least 5%. The U.S. economy has seen prices rising at an annual rate of 5% or more every single month following President Biden's first 100 days. Democrats' reckless spending has made soaring costs a fixture of everyday life for families all across our country. Real wage declines have become a tragic reality for workers in every single state. Last week, new data proved yet again that persistent inflation has become actually embedded in our economy. One key measure of consumer behavior, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, grew at triple the monthly rate from December and at its fastest pace since June of last year. Inflation in the services sector in particular is 5.7% higher than it was a year ago. The Democrats' inflation is not just driving up the prices for groceries and essentials that families pay themselves at the checkout counter. It's also baked into the cost families pay indirectly through service providers, from plumbers to contractors to medical providers and beyond. In every corner of the economy, workers and businesses are still having to hunker down against the ongoing consequences of Democrats' reckless mistakes. What an odd time, then, for the Biden administration to declare victory over a problem it helped actually create. The White House press secretary declared earlier this month that the president's economic plan is indeed working. Well, today, 57% of Americans say they have less money in their pocket than they did a year ago. Nearly two-thirds say they're living paycheck to paycheck. The White House calls this mission accomplished. The American people call it a nightmare for 2 years and counting. Mr. President.
Minority Leader.
For over 2 years, the Biden administration has failed to attend to some of the most basic governing duties: stable prices, secure borders, and safe streets are three of the most fundamental responsibilities that any government owes its people. But Washington Democrats neglected the basics for their pet priorities. They spent trillions of dollars on government goodies that nobody asked for, triggered the worst inflation in 40 years, and turned a blind eye to the border crisis and a crime wave, all occurring on their watch. They caused the damage on party line votes without any input from the Republican side. In response, the American people flipped the House and chose a closely divided Senate. The voters dialed up the checks and the balances. The people went to the ballot box and demanded the Democrats start negotiating and compromising. But the president's refusing to engage. Even as his own advisors say the debt ceiling is approaching fast, the White House is totally MIA. His position has been no negotiation, no reforms. It's such an absurd position that even fellow Democrats are not buying it. The senior senator from West Virginia, a Democrat, has publicly called on the president to sit down with Speaker McCarthy and negotiate. And listen to House Democrats. Get to work. Get it done for the sake of the country, says one. They've got to do it soon, says another. Just a few years ago, the Democratic leader said debt limit talks were, quote, an opportunity for bipartisanship. And what about President Biden himself? Here's what then Vice President Biden said about the debt ceiling back in 2011. Some of them are still unwilling to budge, taking an absolute position. My way or no way. That's not governing, said the Vice President in 2011. My goodness, that's harsh criticism for the 2023 version of President Biden from the 2011 version of Vice President Biden. The Democrats' reckless policies have already dealt far too much damage to our country. This administration's inflation has hammered working families' budgets. Their anti-energy policies have raised gas prices and utility bills. Their attempt to reinvent cash welfare without work requirements hurt small businesses by worsening labor shortages and hurt families by promoting dependence. So the working people of this country have already paid a heavy enough price for Democrat failures. We should not even come within a mile of flirting with a Democratic debt default on top of all the rest. It's time for President Biden to stop the partisan stubbornness, join Speaker McCarthy at the grown-ups table, and get talking.